Cambridge Preparation for the Toefl Test, 4th edition, CD5. Listen to part of a lecture in a cultural studies class.
Okay, let's get started. Now, today I want to continue discussing changes in artistic movements in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Okay, so now we've seen that in all the arts around that time, there was a strong movement away from what was seen as the restrictions of conventional ideas. Artists of all kinds were searching for more individualistic ways of expressing themselves, trying to break new ground, as it were. Now, this was particularly so in the art form of dance, okay? So remember now that by the late 1800s, dance as an art form had become somewhat stale. There were few people trying to push the boundaries of inventiveness on the stage. Now, it was right around this point in time that a new free-moving, free-spirited dancer named Isadora Duncan suddenly became influential. Isadora Duncan is known nowadays as the mother of modern dance because of her important contributions to theatrical dance. And what I want to do here is take a look at some of the ways in which she was just so different from her contemporaries. Okay, so there are at least 3 ways in which she was seen as an innovator, as a new force on the stage. First, we have to consider that at the time in dancing, that is, in particular ballet dancing, it was mostly the feet and leg movements that were highlighted. In other words, dancers of the time focused their skills on highly ritualized and complicated movements of the legs. What Duncan did was to break away from this tradition, from this convention. She was, I think we can say, frustrated by the constrictions of classical dance and by what she felt was its lack of emotional impact. So she took to emphasizing the use of the whole body in dance movement. And this use of the body was inspired by natural forces, as well as folk dancing. And it included skipping, running, and jumping and twirling, a continuous flowing movement done with skillful abandon and great passion. She believed that the movement of the body could express specific emotions like anger, joy, and grief. Let me take a moment to mention that it is said that she learned these dance movements as a child by imitating natural phenomena such as the waves on the beaches near her home in California. All right, so another of her great contributions was her innovative use of costume. Now, again, the dance of the period was notable for its stiff shoes and tunics. Duncan just discarded the restrictiveness of these clothes in favor of loose-flowing gowns inspired by classical Greek models. She danced with loose hair and in bare feet, much to the astonishment of her early audiences. Again, I think we can see the influence here of nature and folk dance, things that conventional dance of the period had ignored, or I think we can even say scorned. So, okay, there was also another way we can consider Isadora as revolutionary in her practice. This is in her use of classical music as an integral part of the performance. She insisted that her art deserved to be performed to great music. For example, Beethoven, Bach, and Chopin, and other great concert music accompanied her movements on stage. And this use of music was considered daring and original at the time. Now, I think looking back, it may be kind of hard to appreciate Isadora Duncan's achievement, since so many of her contributions to modern dance are nowadays, in a sense, taken for granted. In truth, she at first had to face considerable opposition from traditionalists, as happens to many highly original artists. Her, for the time, unconventional techniques eventually, though, were widely acclaimed. Perhaps all modern dance technique owes something to Duncan's inventiveness and daring. So, perhaps because of that, her deep originality may not be as obvious to us today.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you answer. 18. What is the lecture mainly about? 19. What does the professor imply about other artists of Duncan's time? 20. Which of the following may have been an influence on Duncan's art? 21. Which of the following does the professor consider a contribution of Duncan's? 22. In the lecture, the professor describes some of the main contributions made by Isadora Duncan to modern dance. Indicate whether each of the following is a contribution made by this dancer. 23. What is the professor's attitude toward Isadora Duncan's innovations? 24. What does the professor imply about Duncan's current status? 'Listen to part of a lecture in an astronomy class.
So, I hope you now have an idea about the most accepted theory of how the Sun and the solar system were formed. In fact, many new observations are showing major problems with this traditional view of planetary formation. For example, some scientists are now saying that the time frame is all wrong. The planets may have formed much more quickly than the standard theory suggests. And there are other problems too when it comes to the formation of the outer planets, especially about how and where they formed. Some people are saying we may have to revise or even abandon the standard model. As with many theories in science, it's pretty much open to revision. But now, let's move on to an examination of what happened inside the Earth in its early stages. I know some of you have studied Earth formation in other courses, but I want to fill in the gaps for those who haven't got this background. OK, so, about 4.6 million years ago, the Earth was pretty much organised into a sphere and had a temperature of around 1,000 degrees. Note also that all the material forming the planet was randomly spread around. But at that point, three things were happening which caused the planet to heat up further. So, what kind of things would cause the planet to get hotter?
All the impacts from rocks and meteorites and other stuff in space. When that stuff hits the Earth, that impact energy would be converted into heat energy. That would heat it up.
OK, good. Well, sure, that's one of the three main causes of this heating. Certainly at the upper levels, the crust of the planet. Now, what else?
The sun would have heated it?
Well, yes, but I don't just mean warming the surface. We're talking about heating the planet right down to the core, the centre. How did the Earth heat up so that iron, for example, could melt? That's at about 2,000 degrees Celsius.
What about radiation?
Yes, that's it. That is probably the most important cause of the heating up. Radioactive elements, such as uranium, within the rocks inside the planet decayed, and as they did so, heat was generated. In fact, radioactive decay is still going on, but at a slower rate than previously, since, of course, Well, there isn't nearly as much radioactive material left due to this decay over time. OK, a third cause of the heating process was compression due to gravity. As the size of the planet grew due to impacts from space, the gravity increased, and the pressure itself contributed to the heating of the Earth's interior. So, we have three main causes of the heating up of the planet. Now, just to repeat, impacts from the objects outside the planet, radioactive decay of the elements inside, and heating due to pressure caused by gravity. So, over the course of 1 billion years, all these things eventually pushed up the heat until temperatures were hot enough to melt iron and other rocks. Now, as you know, the Earth is composed of a variety of different types of materials, and so these rocks and minerals have different densities. So, that means that heavier, the denser material tends to sink over time, and lighter material tends to rise and float above the heavier stuff. That is what happens in a liquid or molten environment, of course. So iron, in particular, being heavy, sank toward the centre, and lighter rocky material rose toward the surface. At the same time, gases escaped from the molten rocks and came out at the surface, allowing an atmosphere and oceans to form. When all this sinking and rising, this reshuffling process eventually slowed down over time with the gradual cooling of the planet, what we find is a stratified Earth. In other words, a series of layers, with the crust, that is the part we live on, being the lightest, then further down the mantle, then the outer core, and finally, at the centre, the inner core. So, this process, called differentiation, led to the change in the arrangement of the interior structuring of the planet and the formation of the atmosphere and the oceans. So, while originally all material was homogeneous, randomly mixed around the planet, eventually we get a planet divided into different layers. This differentiation has been called perhaps the single most important event in the history of the Earth.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you answer. 25. What is the main topic of the lecture? (26) Why does the professor say this?
As with many theories in science, it's pretty much open to revision.
27. What does the professor imply about the formation of the Earth? 28. According to the professor, how was rock distributed before differentiation? 29. According to the professor, which is probably the main reason for the heating of the Earth? 30. What 2 points are true according to the lecture? 'Listen to conversation between a student and an advisor at the University Learning Center.
Hi, Mrs. Douglas. I'm Jack. I made an appointment to talk to you about graduate school.
Yeah, come in, Jack. Have a seat.
Thanks. I've only just started thinking about going to grad school, and I looked at the application, what you have to do to apply here, and I found it a bit overwhelming. Writing a personal statement, asking my professors for letters of recommendation, sending transcripts. I've already taken the GRE exams.
Okay, so you're applying here?
Well, no. I just looked at the application here to see what it was like. I'm finishing up my bachelor's degree in biology, but I'd like to specialize in marine biology, and they don't offer that here.
So, have you looked around for universities that offer a doctorate in marine biology?
No. I was hoping, well, that's why I came to see you.
Okay, Jack. The first thing we need to do is look in our reference books on university programs to find which universities offer a degree in marine biology and make a list.
A list? Wouldn't it be kind of expensive to apply to a lot of universities?
Well, yeah, if you apply to all of them. But first you'll want to narrow your choices by finding those offering the kind of program you want. And then you'll want to consider other aspects, tuition costs. Well, yeah, if you apply to all of them. But first you'll want to narrow your choices by finding those offering the kind of program you want. And then you'll want to consider other aspects, tuition costs, their financial aid programs, their requirements for entrance.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't thought about all that other stuff, just about the program.
You might want to go to some of the university homepages and find the biology department pages. You could find a list of professors and their specializations. That way, you could see if there's anyone doing research in a particular area. Marine biology is a large field. I assume you have a special interest?
Yeah, the ecology of the intertidal zone.
The intertidal zone. Okay, so when you look at universities, see which ones have professors involved in intertidal zone studies and read some of the articles they've published. Having an idea of the kind of research people are doing might give you an idea of which universities to include on your list and who could advise you in your own research.
Hey, yeah, that's a good idea. I can look at some of the articles that I found really interesting and see what university the writer is affiliated with or where that person studied.
Perfect. When you've made your decision, then you can come back for more help if you need it.
I'll do that.
Right. Now, let's go check those reference books.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you answer. 31. What does the student need from the advisor? 32. Where will the student and the advisor look for the information the student needs on university degree programs? 33. What can be inferred about applying to graduate school? 34. Listen again to part of the conversation. Then answer the question.
That way, you could see if there's anyone doing research in a particular area. Marine biology is a large field. I assume you have a special interest?
Why does the advisor say this?
I assume you have a special interest?
35. Why does the advisor suggest that the student read some of the Part 2, Building Skills, Speaking, Exercise S1, Concentrating on individual consonant sounds. 1,
Peter called us up and invited us for supper.
2,
The robbers escaped in a stolen cab and drove to their hideout, but they were eventually caught.
3,
The children went on a scavenger hunt, and the victorious team was given a prize.
4,
The dog followed the caddy around the golf course.
5,
Schools can do more to encourage students to take on the responsibilities of learning.
6,
The big logging companies are gone from the region.
7,
If the fish stocks are depleted, it will be the fishermen who suffer.
8,
The very first editions of the manuscripts are available for everyone to see.
9,
They are rethinking the rule of thumb that requires people to stay on the path.
10,
The mother decided to bathe her baby.
11,
A lesson in building a house made of sod was offered at the outdoor museum.
12,
The zoologists use tranquilizers when tagging the deer that enter the park.
13,
Careful land management has saved the rim area from overgrazing.
14,
The judges named the winner as soon as the race was over.
15,
Singing a favorite song is a good way to cheer oneself up.
16,
The land grant allows for full use of resources.
17,
Cooperative games help children to realize their potential in a non-threatening situation.
18,
The people in the tower witnessed how fast the fire was spreading.
19,
The Children's Hospital has perhaps the best doctors to deal with the problem.
20,
A layer of yellowish sandstone marks the division between the two geological periods.
21,
Since the idea in a demolition derby is to demolish the car, drivers should continue until this has been achieved.
22,
The genre of art called the collage is a pleasure to work in.
23,
By chance, a farmer uncovered the rich burial site that had survived in nature for several centuries.
24,
According to Jim, changing over to the computerized system led to a surge in interest.
25, Exercise S2, concentrating on consonant clusters.
Snowflakes swirled around the makeshift huts as the drifts, shifted by the howling winds, mounted up against the walls. The drafty huts creaked and groaned in response. Then door hinges squeaked as abominable snowmen stepped across the thresholds into the sparsely furnished rooms. Marge strained her vocal cords as she screamed in an attempt to bring help. Her blood-curdling screams woke her from the terrible dream.
Exercise S3, focusing on stress patterns.
Theaters of the Elizabethan period were open-air constructions
in which poorer members of the audience, the groundlings, stood in a space called the pit around three sides of a projecting rectangular platform that formed the main stage. Most of the perimeter of the building comprised covered, tiered galleries, and it's here that the wealthier members of the audience sat. A roof supported on two pillars projected from the back wall and covered part of the stage. The main stage was hollow and could be accessed from below through trap doors set in the floor. The main stage also had a door on either side at the back, which gave access to the dressing rooms. Between these doors was a small recess, usually curtained off, that could be used for extra stage space. Above this recess was a balcony sometimes used by musicians or, when necessary, by actors in a performance.
Exercise S4. Focusing on linking words.
It's simply not feasible for every university library in the nation to contain all the books, journals, and resource materials that university students and faculty need for their research. So what have libraries done to meet the needs of their users? Well, several things, in fact. While some money is used for the yearly purchasing of hardbound books and current journals that are recommended by professors, other funds are used to obtain materials that have been put on microfilm and microfiche. These techniques have proved extremely useful for adding informative materials to a library's collection at a low cost and without taking up much space. Another way libraries have increased access has been to invest in computers. Computers are linked to collections in other libraries. Professors and students can perform a computer search to find a library that has the material they need. The material can then be ordered and checked out through the interlibrary loan system, which costs the user a nominal shipping fee.
Exercise S5. Focusing on intonation.
Professor Klein?
Yes?
I'm Robert Daly. The work-study office sent me.
Oh, I've been waiting for them to send someone. Did you say your name was Robert?
Yes.
What's your major, Robert?
Zoology.
Good. You have some science background then. Let me show you what we're doing in our lab.
Will I be working in the biology lab?
Yes. We're studying the speed of reproduction of paramecia. Paramecia are the most complex single-celled organisms.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
Well, what we need you to do is probably not so interesting.
And what is that?
We'll need you to come in every day at the same time and count the paramecia.
Count paramecia?
Yes. It's very important to keep an accurate count and fill the numbers in on a form. I'll show you where the forms are and explain how to complete it later. After you've completed the form, you need to give it to Nancy. She's the woman that you met in the lab office. She'll feed your numbers into the computer for our statistical analysis. Right now, though, I want to introduce you to the other members of our team so that we can arrange a convenient time for you to come in.
Exercise S6. Putting it all together.
Treasured since ancient times, saffron is from the autumn-flowering Crocus sativus. It is the dried flower stigmas, the three slender threads in the center of each flower, that are the source of saffron. This king of spices is one of the world's most prized and expensive foodstuffs. The finest variety is grown in La Mancha, in the central plateau of Spain. Spain is by far the biggest producer. It contributes 70% of the world's output, with India and Iran the only other producers of note. The cultivation of saffron in Spain goes back to the Moorish invasion of the 8th century, when the crocuses were first introduced from the Middle East. Not only is Spain the largest producer of saffron, but it is also the largest consumer. Up to 1/3 of the crop is bought in Spain, and the remainder is exported. The biggest buyers are Middle Eastern countries, followed by the United States, Italy, and France.
Exercise S15. Restating the task and defining your choice. 1. Name a teacher who has influenced you and explain why that teacher was important. Include details and examples to support your explanation. 2. Describe a class you have taken and explain why that class was important to you. Include details and examples to support your explanation. 3. Exercise S18. Putting it all together. 1. Name a skill you have learned and explain why it is important to you. Include details and examples to support your explanation. 2. Name a hobby you have and explain why it is important to you. Include details and examples to support your explanation. 3. Name a person who has influenced you and explain why that influence was important. Include details and examples to support your explanation. 4. Describe a class you have taken and explain why that class was important to you. Include details and examples to support your explanation. Exercise S21. Restating the task and stating your position. Some students would like to have a long vacation during the academic year. Other students would like to have several shorter vacations during the academic year. What is your preference and why? Include details and examples in your explanation. Exercise S24. Putting it all together. 1. Some students prefer to do group projects. Other students prefer to do individual projects. Which kind of projects do you think produce more learning, and why? 2. Some people believe that students should immediately go on to college after completing high school. Others believe that students should take a year off between high school completion and starting college. Which approach do you think is better for students interested in getting a college degree? Include details and examples in your explanation. 3. Some students would like to have a long vacation during the academic year. Other students would like to have several shorter vacations during the academic year. What is your preference and why? Include details and examples in your explanation. Exercise S26. Practice responding to independent speaking tasks. 1. Name an academic subject that you like and explain why it attracts you. Include details and examples to support your explanation. 2. Describe a personal possession that is special to you and explain why it is important. Include details and examples to support your explanation. 3. Describe a feature of your city that you consider interesting and explain why you think it is interesting. Include details and examples to support your explanation. Four. Some people prefer television programs that present serious issues. Other people prefer those that are for entertainment only. Which kind of program do you consider the most important for people to watch and why? Five. Some people prefer to focus their energy to excel in one activity. Other people prefer to participate in many different activities. Which method do you think is better for the development of a person's intellect and why? Six. Some people believe that children should begin their formal education at an early age, 3 to 5 years old. Other people believe that children should begin their formal education later, 6 to 7 years old. Which age do you think is best for a child to begin a formal education and why? Exercise S27. Identifying important points in a reading passage. An announcement about a change in one of the University of the Rockies courses is posted on the classroom door. You have 45 seconds to read the announcement. Begin reading now. Exercise S28. Identifying important points in a conversation. Now listen to two students as they discuss the announcement.
That's a disappointment. I was looking forward to that class.
Me too. Well, I guess we should hurry on over to the registrar so we can pick up a different course.
Oh, aren't you interested in taking the literature of minority groups? I've heard it's a really good course.
Well, actually, it focuses a lot on Hispanic literature. And being Hispanic, I've already done most of the required reading.
That would make it an easy option then. Come on, let's go before we're late.
Sorry, I'd like the challenge of another course. Besides, with the extra students from the survey course, it's going to be a really large class. I prefer smaller groups. I just feel more comfortable discussing ideas when there aren't so many students.
Exercise S29. Analyzing the task that relates to the conversation. The woman expresses her opinion about the course replacement. State her opinion and explain the reasons she gives for that opinion. Exercise S32. Identifying important points in a reading passage. Now read a passage about an incident leading up to the American War of Independence. You have 45 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Exercise S33. Identifying important points in a lecture. Now listen to part of a lecture on the background to the American War of Independence.
I'd like to address the questions of why the American colonists chose to dress as Indians and why they chose tea to dump overboard. Well, let's go back to why the British had imposed taxes on their colonies. Governments impose taxes to meet expenses. The French and Indian War was over after having doubled the British national debt and leaving the colonists in an economic crisis. Now, remember that the French and Indian War consisted of the French and Indians fighting the British and British colonists. To replenish the treasury, a scheme was passed in the British Parliament in which all goods had to be stamped, a stamp that had to be paid for. This was taxation without representation, and the British colonists wouldn't pay it. After a series of different imposed taxes were met by protests, riots, and boycotts, all taxes were eventually revoked, except for one on tea. Now I think you can see the significance of dressing as Indians, since the taxes stemmed from the French-Indian War, but also why it was tea that was thrown overboard.
Exercise S34. Analyzing the task that relates to the lecture. The professor gives the background information about the incident that was the prelude to the American War of Independence. Explain how the events were related to the colonists' behavior. Exercise S38. Responding to the integrated reading, listening, speaking tasks. 1. The University of the Rockies is planning to tear down a building on campus. Read the announcement about the demolition of the building. You have 45 seconds to read the announcement. Begin reading now. Now listen to two students as they discuss the announcement.
Are you going to join our protest to stop their tearing down Old Main?
You aren't marching about that, are you? We need a fine arts complex.
I don't disagree with that, but the empty lot behind the sports arena could be used.
Well, that's true, but it's a long distance to walk. So what's so special about Old Main anyway?
Well, Old Main was the first building, actually the only building, on campus in the early days, so it has historical value. We should try to preserve our heritage. You know that it was built in the mid-1800s of stone, so built to last.
I didn't know it was that old. But it doesn't have space for classrooms, and I imagine it's a huge expense to heat in winter.
Well, in fact, those heavy walls keep heat in, so it isn't expensive. They could use it for offices. There's a shortage of offices for graduate students who have teaching assistantships.
The man expresses his opinion of the plans being made by the University Board of Trustees. State his opinion and explain the reasons he gives for holding that opinion. Two, faculty has announced that a guest speaker will be giving a talk. Read the announcement about the talk. You have 45 seconds to read the announcement. Begin reading now. Now listen to two students as they discuss the announcement.
Hey, Sue. Want to go for a coffee?
No, thanks. I'm going to the talk about restless leg syndrome. Why don't you join me?
Never heard of it. So what's your interest?
Well, my mom suffered from it since she was a teenager. At that time, it was diagnosed as growing pains, later as a strained muscle. And then, when she began teaching, she was told it was because she was on her feet all day. After she was told it was all in her head, she quit asking and just went on suffering.
That sounds awful. So, why were the doctors so wrong?
Well, she's always described the pain as thousands of microscopic creatures eating away her calf muscles.
That's weird. So how did she finally find out what it was?
Oh, a cousin mentioned in passing the medicine that she was taking for restless leg syndrome and went on to describe what Mom had been suffering for over 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah, she's on medication now, but I want to know more about it. It runs in families.
So you might get it.
Maybe, but I haven't had any problems yet.
The woman explains her interest in listening to the guest lecturer. State her interest and explain the problems surrounding the syndrome. Three, the University of the Rockies is planning to make a change in the number of required courses in physical education. Read the president's quote taken from his interview with the reporter from the student newspaper. Begin reading now. Now listen to two students as they discuss the quote.
What do you think about the university dropping its physical education requirement?
I'm torn about it, really. In one way, it's true that students should take the responsibility of keeping fit. But how can we if money isn't put into the facilities?
But the president didn't say anything about not putting money into the facilities. He said that the money that's saved from courses that'll no longer be taught would be put elsewhere.
True, but I can't help but think some of our sports programs are going to be affected.
This will only be the loss of some courses. So, what are the programs? What programs are you concerned about?
Well, the women's varsity soccer team, for one. They've worked hard to get any university support at all and are just getting the recognition they deserve.
I hardly think that they'll be affected.
Don't be so sure. Fewer classes will result in a cut in the number of instructors, and that can't help but affect the different programs that are run by those particular instructors.
The woman expresses her opinion of what the president was quoted to have said to the reporter. State her opinion and explain the reasons she gives for holding that opinion. The maintenance department has announced that the main classroom building will be undergoing some changes. Read the announcement about the renovation. You have 45 seconds to read the announcement. Begin reading now. Now listen to two students as they discuss the announcement.
That'll be really great, won't it? All the classrooms will be high-tech.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe.
Maybe? I really like a professor to give a lecture with all sorts of neat computer slides to project on the screen, don't you?
Well, yeah, when it works. But how often have you been excited about doing something special in a lab and the technology failed?
Not that often. It does have to be maintained, though.
And upgraded. Technology becomes obsolete very quickly.
True.
I've also seen a lot of student presentations using technology that were all showy with animation, but no content. It's a big expense, for something that won't be used all that much.
Why don't you think it'll be used?
Well, first, lots of professors aren't high-tech minded and won't bother with learning how to use it. Besides, it's very time-consuming to make a good computer presentation. The best professor I've had here, Dr. Rosa, doesn't even use an overhead projector.
Yeah, well, she's kind of exceptional.
The woman expresses her opinion of the announcement made by the university's maintenance department. State her opinion and explain the reasons she gives for holding that opinion. Now read the passage about marine organisms known as phytoplankton. You will have 45 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture on ocean plants in a marine biology class.
Okay, I'd like to discuss an interesting study being done on phytoplankton. I think we all know that phytoplankton is an important nutrient and its importance in producing oxygen. This study, the study I want to present, was based on the observation that in some areas of the ocean, there's plenty of sunlight and nitrogen compounds for a successful photosynthesis. However, there's only a small amount of phytoplankton. So an analysis was done on the water, and this analysis indicated a lack of iron. We know that iron is a trace mineral that even humans need. It was hypothesized that phytoplankton also need iron. I won't go into full detail, but a small section of one area in the ocean was seeded with iron sulfate. The resulting increase of phytoplankton provided convincing evidence for the hypothesis. Now, this finding opens up several possibilities. Since phytoplankton take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, an increase of the plants could remove a significant amount of human-produced carbon dioxide from the atmosphere faster and more effectively than other alternatives. An increase in the plants could also be followed by an increase and more effectively than other alternatives. An increase in the plants could also be followed by an increase of marine life along the food chain that ultimately comes to feed people. However, there are unanswered environmental questions that would need to be addressed before phytoplankton farms could be considered.
The professor describes an experiment done on phytoplankton. Explain how the implications of this experiment relate to phytoplankton. 6. Now read the passage about road management. You will have 45 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture in a civil engineering class.
Okay, so we're all familiar with the road markings, signs, and signals cluttering up our cities. They are supposed to reduce accidents, make towns safer for all of us. Well, accidents still happen, but all these signs surely make accidents fewer. They tell road users where it's safe to be and when. Well, experiments have shown something very different. A Dutch traffic engineer named Hans Monderman has turned this thinking on its head. Monderman removed the traffic signs, markings, and signals from a Dutch town. And guess what? The number of traffic accidents has dropped significantly. In this town, there are no center lines separating lanes, no speed limit signs, no stop signs, and even speed bumps have been removed. The thinking behind this radical change is that when drivers have no signs to guide them, they start looking at people, and then they drive more carefully, more courteously. This public space makes drivers instinctively understand that cars and pedestrians are equal, and drive with this in mind. Supporters of this scheme explain its success by arguing that road regulations give a false sense of security. Regulations also treat road users as irresponsible by continually controlling their behavior, telling them what they can and can't do. When the props supporting this regulation are removed, drivers are given back the responsibility for driving with consideration for other drivers and pedestrians, and then act accordingly.
The professor describes an experimental system of road management. Explain how this experiment is related to road users' behavior. Seven. Now read the passage about cultural perceptions of time. You will have 45 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture in a cultural studies class.
We were talking about monochronic and polychronic cultures last week, and I wanted to repeat some of the things we discussed. Remember that these are the extremes, and most cultures lie somewhere in between. We also discussed that there are monochronic individuals within polychronic cultures, and vice versa, polychronic ones within monochronic cultures. Now, one might think that a monochronic society is more efficient because monochronic individuals can make a linear plan, predict how long it will take, and follow through on it. They arrive on time, set deadlines that they meet, and can be depended on to get the work done on time. But how often have you read in job advertisements that they're looking for someone who can multitask? So what does that mean? Someone who can do several things at once, right? And who can do that? A polychronic person. In essence, They are people who can step in and be moved around within a company. These are the people who become irreplaceable on the job because of their ability to juggle several tasks at the same time. Interestingly, while efficient polychronic people are appreciated at the workplace, they frequently don't move up the promotional ladder. Why? Because it isn't easy to replace a person who can multitask effectively.
The professor describes the behavior of monochronic and polychronic people. Explain how their behavior is related to their suitability in the workplace. Eight. The passage about weathering. You have 45 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture on weathering in a geology class.
When we examine rocks in terms of the weathering process, it's obvious that the climatic environments must also be taken into account. Think about the weather conditions in arid areas. In those areas, the frost at night expands along cracks in the rocks, and in the day, the rocks expand in the heat. This mechanical process of weathering due to the fluctuation between frost action and heat expansion is common. Now, in the tropical areas where rainfall is heavy, the chemical process is common. There's less mechanical weathering since the temperature remains high. In temperate climates, where we can see a warm summer with rainfall and a colder winter with frost, both chemical and mechanical weathering are common. What about the polar regions? Well, we are not going to see much weathering in terms of chemical processes since there's little rainfall. Neither will we see many mechanical or biological processes. The Arctic conditions allow very little weathering, in fact. Now, what about biological processes? The weathering caused by tree and plant roots wedging into the rocks, animals burrowing into the ground, or the decay of organisms causing destructive acids? Well, plants and animals live in all areas. But again, because we see fewer plants and animals in areas of extreme climates, we see less biological weathering there.
The professor describes climatic conditions. Explain how these conditions relate to different weathering processes. Program continues on the next CD.